So right now this is shooting without any picture profile on. When it's very punchy, everything's kind of there. This is if I want to go straight out of the camera. I have a quick project and I don't want to do any color correction because it's going to give me no room to really do anything. And now let's switch to Slog2. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Sony line of cameras, and when it comes to shooting in Cine 4, Slog2, and Slog3, and then when it comes to dynamic range. And what is dynamic range? And dynamic range is from the brightest whites to the blackest blacks, how much range in between. And normally you can go from, anywhere from 13 to in Slog3, you can go up to 70 stops of dynamic range. So how much detail can you retain from, the darkest blacks and shadows? In the shadows, how much detail can you discover from there? How much does the film, your camera take from there? And then like whites, like in clouds, how much detail from the clouds can it retain and pull? In what picture profile you should choose when shooting different things to get the most dynamic range, and how much dynamic range do you actually need? So I'm gonna give you an example. When I do weddings outside, especially ceremonies outside, it is very, very, very bright. And when shooting in Slog2 and Slog3, you have to shoot at ISO 1600 in the A7S2. It used to be you had to shoot in 3200, and unless you wanted to slap a ND filter on there, it was horrible. Now when you switch to Cine 4, you can shoot at ISO 200, so it's a lot better. Many stops. You can stop your camera down when it comes to shooting in bright weather where everything would be overexposed if you shot in Slog2 and Slog3. So what should you choose? Should you choose Slog2 and Slog3, and how much stops the dynamic range? Well, these are the main differences. One, if you shoot in Slog3, you have to take in consideration how much time do you want to spend on color correcting your footage. I mean, there's LUTs out there that help it go faster, but you still gotta tweak those LUTs because Slog3 is super flat, super grainy. Right now I'm shooting on Slog2, and for the purpose of this footage, I'm not going to color correct it until now. This is what it looks like in Slog3 before grading. A lot of people say that this almost looks black and white. The contrast is pulled down. Lots of detail in the shadows, lots of detail in the highlights. So this is the picture profile that you're going to be able to get the most detail out of. But you have to shoot at ISO 1600, which in darker rooms is not a problem. And a lot of people are like, man, that's really noisy. Like me coming from the Canon world, ISO 3200 is like, that's it. After that, the footage, you can't really use it. Now with the Sony line of cameras, you can go up to like 128,000 and still have usable footage. But with Slog3, you're gonna get the noisy footage compared to Cine 4, Cine 2, and Slog2. And so I'm going to show you how to set up your camera for each profile and to get the most dynamic range out of it. All right, so the very first thing that we're going to set up is our zebras. Let's go into menu. At the very top, we're going to go over to this gear wheel, and where it says zebras, we're going to put it at 100 plus. These are all the different amounts so you can put the sensitivity to zebra. So that's off. Set it to 100 plus. Now we're going to go over to our ISO. And so if we darken our ISO down, Lowest we can go is 1600, and if we zoom in on those pillows, you can't see a lot of detail in those pillows. They're microfiber pillows, but we'll show you how we can bring some details up in those. So what we're going to do is you want to bring up your ISO to maximize your dynamic range right before we start seeing those zebras. You can tell when we're way overexposed, that's too much. Now with these profiles, the camera has a hard time adjusting what is overexposed. So what you want to do is bring up your histogram to show you, what's overexposed and what's underexposed. And so when we start seeing the zebras, we know it's too bright. Bring it down a couple stops. And for the maximum dynamic range, this being an Slog2, this is going to give us the best results. So now when we zoom in on those pillows, there's a little bit of noise, but we can see far more detail in those pillows now. From Slog2 to now Cine 4. And now we're focused. Now we're going to bring up, we're starting to see overexposure at like 800 ISO. Zoom in, you can't get as much detail now. Stuff is a little more saturated. It's not so much grayscale anymore. We won't need to do as much to post, but we don't have as many stops in the dynamic range. Now we'll go back and we'll change this back to Slog2. Bring up that ISO, and now we have probably about 14-15 stops of dynamic range. Now Slog3, and now the picture is almost just gray. You can't really see that much color difference, and this gives us a lot more stops of dynamic range. These picture profiles work for the A7 series, or if you have like this one is a 6300. This is kind of my backup setup that I use. So both these picture profiles work for both cameras, so it makes it very nice when you go into post-production and you have different cameras. All the footage is going to match up. When it comes to the picture profile, this is a crop sensor, so it's going to have a little bit more noise at different ISOs, but at least the footage will be very comparable. It's not like you're going, hey, those are two completely different cameras, when the footage is being edited in post. So now I'm explaining to you the benefits of each profile and when you'd want to use them. So my favorite, especially when it comes to outdoors and ceremonies and stuff with that kind of element, is Cine 4. And Cine 4, you have a minimum ISO of 200. There is a fair amount of color. It is pretty flat, but there is still some color in it, so you don't need to do as much correction in post. So the other profiles, you have a minimum ISO of like 1600. So unless you want to slap an ND filter on it when you're outside, I select Cine 4 when doing like ceremonies, and that's where it benefits. And you don't need the higher ISOs to maximize its dynamic range. Now Slog3 has the most stops of dynamic range. You need to bump up the ISO to maximize the stops in dynamic range, and then it has more noise in the darker areas. And so you got to really think, how many stops of dynamic range do you actually need when it comes to getting the right footage? It is super gray. There's no color in this whatsoever. A lot of people describe it as almost being a black and white image. So you're going to have, out of all the profiles, spend the most time color grading, color correcting, using LUTs on it and stuff like that. But it's going to take the most work to get a very good image when you're done. It has a ISO minimum of 1600. So you got to bump it up just a little bit. It's great for dark rooms. Like I said, it brings the detail out of the shadows and also retains it in the highlights. So just got to kind of think about the different situations that you want to use it in. People also say that there is some banding issues in the highlights when you're using Slog3. So you got to kind of weigh how much time do you want to spend on color correcting, how much usable stops of dynamic range do you need, and where you want to set your ISO to maximize all those. Now, the one that I use the most is Slog2. And from 2 to 3, there is not as much noise in the shadows. And a lot of times I don't need as many stops of dynamic range, and I can kind of control my elements by, adding lights. So I don't need as many stops, and that way I can bump down my ISO so there's no noise in the shadows. So Slog2 is the one that I use the most when it comes to interior, and then when I'm outside shooting, I stick to Cine 4. So that's kind of my explanation when choosing the profile. So now I'm going to show you some clips of Slog2, Slog3, and Cine 4, and the different scenarios that I use them in.